I want to speak briefly about what I think is the original sin, but I don't believe, as I said, in one factor. I think there are several factors, but NATO expansion. You know, at the end of the Soviet Union, and by the way, I want to post, Steve wrote a 10.2-page article. Some of it's in the book about how the Soviet Union ended. He very, in a scholarly way, reviewed all the different theories, you know, the empire, corruption, regions, and he came to a view which he never liked because he didn't believe in men making history, you know, but he did because he had, but it, you know, the collision of Yeltsin and Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin had a will to power, Gorbachev had a will to reform. They clashed on the stage. And in that, Yeltsin, the head of Belarus and the head of Ukraine at the time, went into a forest. This, you've probably read this, in Belarus called the Bielozhevsk Forest, and signed a treaty ending the Soviet Union. So, but this end of the Soviet Union led to the discussions in Berlin, as you've followed, I'm sure, about the reunification of Germany and the promise to Gorbachev on the part of James Baker and George H.W. Bush and Kohl that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. A few years later, the epicenter of the Cold War, I mean, in 2008, there was a, you know, the Bucharest summit, and suddenly Ukraine and Georgia were being offered NATO membership. There was a lot more in between, but at that time, people understood, Americans spoke out, there was more of a debate about how dangerous NATO expansion was. And there are documents. I know there are people who still contest that this was an actual promise, but do you know the National Security Archives? It's a very good organization in Washington. They do a lot of work. It's a nonprofit. They do a lot of work on Central America, South America, but they have a team which has all the primary documents from the Gorbachev Foundation and team, which showed the actual primary documents. In any case, even bigger than NATO expansion is what, at the end of the Soviet Union, at the end of the Berlin Wall, there was a triumphalism that America had won the Cold War. Those who were on the scene, like Ambassador Jack Matlock, no one won the Cold War. The Cold War was negotiated to an end. He would say, and Reagan and Gorbachev would say, nuclear war must never be waged, it can never be won. But there was a sense that the Russia that emerged at the end of the Soviet Union was weak, was on its knees, that it was a junior partner. And part of Putin coming to power, and his first act was to give Yeltsin and his family immunity from corruption, was to say, we're going to put this country back together. And it collapsed twice, 1917, 1991. And in putting it back together, there was brutality then, Yeltsin's first Chechen war, Putin's second Chechen war. But I would say there were two important dates. 2007, when Putin went to the Munich Security Conference and said, this is no longer a unipolar world, Russia's back. And he spoke of Iraq, it was the height of the Iraq war. And he spoke of no longer being the junior partner. John McCain and Joe Lieberman and Angela Merkel sat in the front row, and their faces are still worth watching today, because you see they went back to Washington and there was great fear that Russia was back. And the second was 2008, which we've talked about, the Bucharest summit, where Ukraine and Georgia were kind of offered quick pass, but the Europeans didn't want it. So I believe that that triumphalism. So I want to leave you with a thought that there were roads not taken, there were alternatives. There was an idea at the end of the Cold War that instead of NATO expansion, you might have a transatlantic European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Why, when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, did NATO continue? It is part of what, I mean, I've learned this term, you probably know it, I can never get it right, Ray McGovern. We've had our issues, but Mickey Matt, you know, it's no longer simply the military industrial, and even Eisenhower spoke of it as the military industrial congressional complex, but the media, the internet, But there was a demilitarized path, and there was a different security architecture that was laid out, and that for a brief moment in Berlin before James Baker and, I think the United States they tried to reach out to Russia, but so momentarily and so briefly that there was never a real effort to include Russia in the security architecture of a new Europe. And in that bred grievances.